here you go, sign this and be my date just for tonight.
Picture this. A lavish wedding hall in the heart of Seoul, dripping with white orchids and crystal chandeliers. At the altar stands Kang Minho, one of the most feared men in South Korea's underground world, a crime lord whose name makes even hardened criminals look over their shoulders. And beside him, in a stunning white gown that catches every light in the room, is Sienna Valdez, a black American woman whose presence has sent shockwaves through Seoul's criminal elite. The room is thick with tension. You can see it in the faces of Minho's family members, stone-faced men in expensive suits who built their empire on blood and secrets. They're watching in silent disbelief. And there, in the third row, sits Han Yuri, Minho's ex-girlfriend, her perfectly made-up face barely concealing the shock and jealousy burning in her eyes. But here's the question that nobody in that room can answer. How did a fake date hired purely for revenge turn into the most dangerous love story Seoul has ever seen? How did $75,000 and a contract turn into vows that would change everything? To understand that, we need to go back 6 months. 6 months earlier, Seoul was living and breathing as it always does. A city where ancient temples sit in the shadows of glass skyscrapers, where tradition and modernity collide every single day. And in a tiny studio apartment in 81, barely big enough to fit a bed and a small kitchen, lived Sienna Valdez. 28 years old, originally from Atlanta, Georgia and running on fumes and dreams. Sienna had come to Korea 3 years ago with stars in her eyes and a suitcase full of hope. She'd grown up in Atlanta, the daughter of a Baptist pastor, surrounded by music and faith and big Sunday dinners. But Sienna had always wanted more than what her small community could offer. She wanted stages, lights, international theater, a career that would take her breath away. So she'd saved every penny from her college jobs, bought a one-way ticket to Seoul, and chased a dream that seemed just within reach. 3 years later, that dream was still just out of reach. Sienna spoke conversational Korean, enough to order food and handle basic conversations, but not quite enough to land the major theater roles she'd imagined. Instead, she was doing background work, standing silently in Korean dramas and commercials, her face barely visible in crowd scenes. She taught English to elementary school kids on the side, making just enough to cover her rent in that cramped Itaewon studio and send a little money home to her mom. She was tall and elegant, with natural hair she wore in intricate braids that turned heads on the subway. She had the kind of presence that made people look twice, a confidence in the way she carried herself that suggested she belonged anywhere she walked. But beneath that confident exterior was a woman who checked her bank account 3 times a day and lay awake at night wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake leaving home. Sienna was quick-witted, observant, the kind of person who could read a room in seconds and adjust accordingly. She'd had to develop that skill to survive in a country where she often felt like an outsider, where strangers sometimes stared a little too long, where she was constantly navigating a culture that wasn't quite ready for her. Now let's talk about Kang Minho. If Sienna was struggling to find her place in Seoul, Minho had the opposite problem. He had too much power, too much influence, too much of everything except the one thing he actually wanted: respect that wasn't built on fear. Minho was 35, tall and intimidating in his perfectly tailored designer suits, with cold eyes that gave away absolutely nothing. He was a second-generation crime boss, the heir to an empire his father had built through violence and strategic ruthlessness. But unlike his father, Minho had been educated at Harvard Business School. He spoke perfect English, understood international markets, and had spent years legitimizing parts of the family business. On paper, he owned luxury hotels, high-end nightclubs, and prime real estate across Seoul. In reality, those businesses were fronts for money laundering, illegal gambling operations, and dealings that existed in the shadows where law enforcement couldn't quite reach. Minho lived between two identities and he'd mastered both. In boardrooms, he was the sophisticated businessman, charming investors with his intelligence and vision. In back rooms, he was the calculating crime lord who made decisions that affected life and death. He rarely lost his composure. Control was everything to him. Emotions were weaknesses, and in his world, weaknesses got you killed. But 3 months before our story really begins, something happened that cracked Minho's carefully constructed armor. His girlfriend, Han Yuri, left him. Now, Yuri wasn't just any girlfriend. She was a socialite from another powerful Korean family, the kind of woman who'd been groomed since birth to make strategic alliances. She was beautiful, poised, and utterly calculating. For 2 years, she and Minho had been Seoul's power couple, photographed at every major event, whispered about in every social circle. But then Yuri's family saw an opportunity. A rival organization, one that had been competing with Minho's family for territory and influence, had a son. An alliance between these two families could end years of conflict and create a monopoly that would dominate Seoul's underground economy. So Yuri made her choice. She left Miho for the rival's son, announcing their engagement at a charity gala that Miho was attending. She didn't even have the decency to tell him privately. She just walked up to him with her new fiancé, smiled that perfect smile, and said the engagement had been arranged by their families. It was strategic, cold, and brutally public. The humiliation cut deeper than Miho wanted to admit. In his world, image was everything. Respect was currency. And Yuri had just broadcasted to everyone who mattered that Kang Minho wasn't powerful enough to keep his woman, that he could be discarded for a better deal. His organization noticed. His rivals noticed. Whispers started circulating that maybe Miho was losing his edge, that maybe he was weak, that maybe his family's empire was ready to be challenged. Miho's pride wasn't just wounded. It was bleeding out in front of everyone who'd ever feared him. He needed to do something. He needed to remind Seoul that he was still the man nobody crossed. He needed revenge, not through violence but through something far more subtle. He needed to make Han Yuri regret her decision. He needed to make her jealous. He needed someone who would turn every head when she walked into a room, someone who would make Yuri question whether she'd given up something real for a cold business transaction. He needed someone unexpected, someone bold, someone who would shatter every expectation Seoul's elite had about who belonged on Kang Minho's arm. And that's when fate, or perhaps just coincidence, brought Sienna Valdez into his line of sight. It happened at one of Miho's luxury hotels during a product launch event. Sienna was there doing background work, dressed in all black, holding a tray of champagne glasses, trying to blend into the scenery. That's what background actors do. They become invisible. But Sienna had never quite mastered invisibility. She was too striking, too present. And on this particular night, she was standing near the entrance when Han Yuri walked in with her new fiancé. Miho was across the room and he saw them immediately. He felt that familiar tightness in his chest, that flash of anger he'd been suppressing for 3 months. Yuri looked radiant and smug, her arm linked with her new partner, playing her role perfectly. And then Sienna, focused on balancing her tray, accidentally stepped backward right into Yuri's path. Champagne splashed across Yuri's designer dress, pale liquid spreading across expensive white silk. The entire room seemed to freeze. Yuri's face transformed from shock to absolute fury. She turned on Sienna with vicious precision, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. She berated Sienna in rapid Korean, calling her clumsy and careless, but there was something else in her tone, something uglier. Subtle racist undertones about foreigners not understanding Korean standards, about people who don't belong trying to fit in where they're not wanted. Sienna stood there, her face calm but her eyes flashing with barely contained anger. She apologized in perfect Korean, her voice steady and dignified, refusing to be diminished. She offered to pay for the dry cleaning, even though Sienna probably couldn't afford it. And then she met Yuri's eyes with a look that said she saw exactly what kind of person was standing in front of her. Miho watched the entire exchange from across the room. He watched how Sienna handled humiliation with grace. He watched how she refused to shrink even when everyone was staring. He watched how Yuri's cruelty only made Sienna stand taller. And in that moment, an idea began forming in his calculating mind. This woman, this striking black American woman who just faced down his ex-girlfriend with quiet dignity, could be exactly what he needed. She was unexpected. She was bold. She was everything Yuri and Seoul's elite wouldn't expect. She was perfect. So what would you do if a stranger offered you $75,000 to pretend to be in love? Would you take the money or would you walk away? Drop your answer in the comments below, because Sienna's decision is about to change everything. And if you're already hooked on this story, hit that subscribe button right now because what happens next is going to blow your mind. That same night, after the event ended and Sienna was walking to the subway station, counting the meager tips she'd made and wondering how she'd afford next month's rent, a black Mercedes pulled up beside her. The back window rolled down and a man in an expensive suit looked out at her. His name was Jin Taek, and he was Kang Minho's right-hand man, the person who handled everything Minho didn't want to dirty his hands with. Jin Taek's voice was polite but firm. Mr. Kang would like to speak with her. It wasn't really a request. Sienna's heart started racing. She'd lived in Korea long enough to know that when men in expensive cars wanted to talk to you at night, it rarely ended well. But something in her, maybe desperation or curiosity or just exhaustion with being afraid, made her get in that car. They drove back to the hotel, but instead of the crowded event space, she was taken to a private office on the top floor. And there, sitting behind a massive desk with the Seoul skyline glittering behind him, was Kang Minho. He looked at her with those cold, calculating eyes and got straight to the point. He needed someone to play a role. His ex-girlfriend had humiliated him publicly, and he needed to respond in kind. He wanted to hire Sienna to be his girlfriend for 1 month, 6 high-profile events where Seoul's elite would see them together, where Han Yuri would see them together. She would need to be convincing, affectionate, completely devoted to the performance. In exchange, he would pay her $50,000. Sienna's mind was spinning. $50,000 was more money than she'd made in the last 2 years combined. It was enough to pay off her student loans. It was enough to renew her visa without stress. It was enough to finally breathe. But as she looked at Kang Minho, sitting there in his perfect suit with his perfect posture and those eyes that revealed absolutely nothing, she felt something twist in her gut. This wasn't just some rich businessman looking for a fake girlfriend. She could feel it. There was something dangerous about him, something that lived beneath the surface of his polished exterior. She asked him directly, what exactly did he do? Who was he really? Minho's answer was carefully vague. He had business interests. He preferred privacy. And anyone who worked with him needed to understand that discretion was absolutely essential. Sienna wasn't stupid. She'd heard the rumors, seen the way other staff at the hotel lowered their voices when certain guests arrived. She knew Seoul had an underworld and she was pretty sure she was looking at someone who operated in it. But she was also looking at a way out of the financial nightmare her life had become. So she did something that surprised even her. She negotiated $75,000, and he had to help with her visa paperwork, provide sponsorship documentation to make the renewal process smooth. She needed stability, not just money. For a moment, Minho just stared at her and Sienna thought she'd pushed too far. But then his lips curved into the smallest smile she'd seen all night. He agreed immediately. Done. $75,000, visa help, 1 month, 6 events. They established the rules right there in that office. This was strictly business. No real feelings. They would spend enough time together to make the relationship believable because Seoul's elite could smell a fake from a mile away. They'd need to learn about each other, create a backstory, be able to answer questions about how they met and what they loved about each other. Sienna asked what would happen if people discovered who he really was, what his actual business involved. Minho's expression went completely cold. He leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. In his world, people who talked about things they shouldn't talk about had very short futures. He could protect her as long as she followed the rules, but if she betrayed him, there would be consequences she didn't want to imagine. The temperature in that office seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sienna felt genuine fear for the first time since getting in that car. She was sitting across from a man who made threats as casually as other people made small talk. She should have walked out right then. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But instead she thought about her bank account. She thought about her visa. She thought about sending money home to her mother who'd been working double shifts at the hospital. She thought about 3 years of struggling and scraping by and being invisible. And she signed the contract. Their first meeting to prepare for the performance was awkward beyond belief. They met at a private cafe Minho owned, closed to the public, just the two of them at a corner table. Minho sat stiffly, treating it like a business negotiation, asking her formulaic questions about her background and interests. Sienna responded with theatrical enthusiasm that felt forced even to her. They were both playing roles, but neither was convincing. After 20 painful minutes, Sienna stopped mid-sentence and looked at him directly. She told him that if he actually wanted to make his ex-girlfriend jealous, he needed to look like a man who was happy, like someone who'd found something real. Right now, he looked like he was conducting a job interview. Minho seemed taken aback. Nobody talked to him that way. But then she said something that caught him completely off guard. She told him that his ex clearly left him for practical reasons, for an alliance and security. So if he wanted to hurt her, he needed to look like he'd found something she'd never given him. Something genuine. Something that couldn't be calculated or arranged. He needed to look like a man in love. And for just a moment, when Sienna said that, something flickered in Minho's eyes. Something that might have been pain or longing or recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by that careful control. But he nodded slowly. She was right. They needed to try harder. So they started over. This time they talked like actual people. Sienna told him about growing up in Atlanta, about her father's church, about the first time she saw a theater production and knew that's what she wanted to do with her life. Minho, to his own surprise, found himself talking about his mother, who died when he was 12, who'd loved classical music and had dreams of him becoming a pianist instead of inheriting his father's empire. For just a few minutes, they weren't a crime lord and a struggling actress. They were two people who'd ended up in places they'd never quite planned to be. And then Sienna made him laugh. She made a sharp observation about how ridiculous it was that they were both pretending to be something they weren't. Maybe they were perfect for each other. It was unexpected and honest, and Minho actually smiled. A real smile, not the calculated ones he used at business meetings. And in that moment, something shifted between them. Something neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. The performance was about to begin, but neither of them realized they were already stepping into something far more dangerous than any contract could contain. Now, you need to understand something about the world Sienna was living in at this point in her life. When you're struggling financially in a foreign country, when you're constantly one emergency away from having to pack your bags and give up on everything you've worked for, you develop a kind of radar. You become hyper-aware of opportunities, even the ones that feel slightly wrong, even the ones that make your stomach twist with uncertainty. And on this particular evening, about 2 weeks after that initial awkward conversation with Minho, Sienna was working yet another background gig at one of Seoul's most exclusive venues. She didn't know it at the time, but this hotel, this gorgeous building with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers and staff who moved like synchronized dancers, was owned by Kang Minho. It was one of his legitimate fronts, one of the businesses that looked perfect on paper while hiding much darker operations beneath its polished surface. The event was a product launch for some luxury skincare brand, the kind of party where champagne flowed freely and everyone wore clothes that cost more than Sienna's monthly rent. She was dressed in the standard uniform for background servers, all black, forgettable, designed to blend into the expensive wallpaper. Her job was simple: hold a tray, smile politely, offer drinks to guests, and above all, be invisible. For 3 hours she'd been doing exactly that, her feet aching in the required heels, her face locked in that professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was counting down the minutes until she could leave, collect her $200 for the night, and go home to her tiny apartment where she could finally take off these painful shoes and eat the instant ramen waiting in her cupboard. But then everything changed in the span of about 30 seconds. Sienna was standing near the main entrance, her tray balanced perfectly in her hands, when she noticed a shift in the room's energy. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they got quieter, more careful. Heads turned subtly toward the door. And that's when she saw him. Kang Minho walked in like he owned the place, which of course he did, though Sienna didn't know that yet. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than her entire year's salary, tailored so perfectly it looked like it had been painted onto his tall frame. His hair was styled with that effortless precision that actually takes significant effort, and he moved with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you're the most powerful person in any room you enter. But what struck Sienna most was his face. He looked cold, controlled, like a man who'd mastered the art of revealing absolutely nothing through his expression. Minho wasn't alone. He was flanked by 2 men in dark suits, clearly security or associates, and they moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency. People greeted him with respectful bows, with careful smiles, with the kind of deference you show to someone who could change your fortune with a single word. And Minho acknowledged them with minimal nods, his eyes scanning the room like he was looking for something specific. Then Sienna saw what he was looking for, or rather, who he was trying to avoid. Across the room, near the bar area, stood a stunning Korean woman in a white designer dress that probably cost more than a used car. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, her makeup flawless, and she was laughing at something the man beside her had said. The man was equally polished, handsome in that carefully groomed way that suggested expensive barbers and personal trainers and a life free from financial worry. The woman's eyes locked onto Minho the moment he entered. Her laughter stopped mid-note. Her expression flickered through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, discomfort, something that might have been guilt, and then a carefully constructed neutrality. This was Han Yuri, though Sienna didn't know her name yet. And the man beside her was her new fiancé, the son of Minho's rival organization, the person Yuri had left Minho for in that strategic, calculated move that had humiliated him 3 months earlier. Sienna watched this silent exchange with the observant eye of someone who'd spent years studying human behavior for her acting work. She could read the tension in the room, the way conversations around these 3 people became performative, the way everyone was pretending not to watch while absolutely watching. Yuri made the first move. She walked toward Minho with her fiancé in tow, her heels clicking against the marble floor with confident precision. When she reached him, she smiled, the kind of smile that looks warm from a distance but holds ice up close. She greeted him in Korean, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by people nearby. She introduced her fiancé, mentioned how wonderful the event was, made small talk that was really a performance for everyone watching. Miho's response was minimal, his voice flat, his body language screaming discomfort even though his face remained neutral. This wasn't a friendly encounter between exes. This was a public display of power dynamics, and Yuri was winning. She'd moved on to a better alliance. She was happy. And Miho was standing there, alone, clearly still affected by her betrayal. Sienna shouldn't have been paying this much attention. Her job was to be invisible, to serve drinks, not to analyze the interpersonal drama of wealthy guests. But she couldn't look away. There was something fascinating about watching this powerful man, this person who commanded such obvious respect from everyone in the room, being so clearly uncomfortable in this moment. And then Yuri's eyes landed on Sienna. Just a brief glance, the kind of look that wealthy people give to service staff, acknowledging their presence while simultaneously dismissing their humanity. Yuri turned back to Miho and said something in Korean that Sienna didn't quite catch, but the tone was sugary sweet with an undercurrent of something cruel. That's when disaster struck. Sienna had been so focused on watching this exchange that she didn't notice another server moving behind her with a tray of empty glasses. The server bumped into Sienna's back, not hard but enough to throw her off balance. Her tray tilted. Time seemed to slow down in that horrible way it does when you know something bad is about to happen and you're powerless to stop it. 3 champagne glasses slid off her tray, and in a moment of panicked instinct, Sienna tried to catch them. She managed to grab 2, but the third one fell, tumbling through the air in what felt like slow motion. The glass didn't shatter on the floor. Instead, the remaining champagne in it splashed outward in a perfect arc, and landed directly across the front of Han Yuri's pristine white designer dress. The entire vicinity went silent. Not just quiet, but absolutely silent, like someone had hit a pause button on reality. Champagne dripped down the expensive fabric, creating a spreading stain across Yuri's chest and stomach. For one frozen moment, nobody moved. Sienna's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She immediately started apologizing in Korean, her accent thick with panic, bowing repeatedly in that way she'd learned was expected when you'd made a serious mistake. She set down her tray and grabbed napkins from a nearby table, trying to help, trying to fix the unfixable. But Yuri's face had transformed into something ugly. All that careful composure, all that polished elegance, shattered in an instant. She stepped back from Sienna's attempted help and unleashed a torrent of angry Korean. Her voice was loud enough that people across the room could hear every word. She called Sienna clumsy and careless, accused her of not watching where she was going, demanded to know how someone so incompetent could be allowed to work at such an exclusive event. But there was something else in her tone, something that made Sienna's skin crawl. Yuri made pointed comments about foreigners not understanding Korean standards of service, about people who come to Korea without proper training or respect for their culture. She asked if the hotel was so desperate for staff that they had to hire people who clearly didn't belong here. The racist undertones weren't even subtle. They were right there, wrapped in a thin veneer of justified anger about a ruined dress. And everyone within earshot heard it. Some people looked uncomfortable but stayed silent. Others pretended they hadn't heard anything. A few nodded along, their own prejudices validated by Yuri's outburst. Sienna stood there, napkins still in her hands, feeling every eye in the vicinity burning into her. She'd experienced microaggressions before during her 3 years in Korea, moments where she felt like an outsider, where people made assumptions about her based on her appearance. But this was different. This was public, loud, and designed to humiliate. And here's what happened next that nobody expected. Sienna straightened up slowly. She set the napkins down on a nearby table. She took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and clear. She apologized again in Korean, her pronunciation careful and deliberate. She said the accident was entirely her fault, that she took full responsibility. She offered to pay for the dry cleaning or replacement of the dress, even though everyone in that room knew she couldn't possibly afford a dress that expensive. But then she met Yuri's eyes directly, and in that moment, something passed between them. Sienna's gaze held quiet dignity, strength, and a clear message. I see exactly who you are, and I'm not afraid of you. Yuri's anger intensified at that look. She snapped that dry cleaning wouldn't be enough, that the dress was ruined, that Sienna should be fired immediately. She turned to Miho, who had been standing there silently watching this entire exchange, and demanded that he speak to the management about the quality of staff they were employing. It was a power move, an attempt to force Miho to participate in her humiliation of Sienna. But Miho didn't respond to Yuri. Instead, his cold eyes were fixed on Sienna, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. He was watching how she handled this humiliation, how she refused to shrink or cry or run away. He saw the flash of anger in her eyes that she was working hard to control. He noticed how she stood tall despite being verbally attacked, how she maintained her composure when most people would have fallen apart. And something clicked in Miho's calculating mind. He'd been thinking about Yuri's betrayal constantly for 3 months, plotting various forms of revenge, discarding ideas that felt too obvious or too crude. He needed something that would genuinely hurt her pride, something that would make her question her decision to leave him. He needed to show her and everyone else that he'd moved on, that he'd found something better. And watching Sienna stand there with quiet strength, this striking black American woman who just faced down his ex-girlfriend without backing down, he realized she was exactly what he needed. She was unexpected. She was bold. She was everything Seoul's elite wouldn't expect to see on his arm. She was perfect for his plan. The hotel manager rushed over at that moment, apologizing profusely to Yuri, assuring her the situation would be handled, shooting Sienna looks that promised serious consequences. Yuri, satisfied that she'd made her point, allowed her fiancé to lead her away toward the restrooms, still complaining loudly about the ruined dress. The crowd slowly returned to their conversations, though many people were still glancing at Sienna, whispering to each other. Sienna stood there feeling her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, knowing she'd probably just lost this job and any chance of getting similar work in the future. Word traveled fast in Seoul's entertainment industry. She gathered her tray and started walking toward the staff area, ready to collect her things and leave before she was officially fired. But as she walked, she felt eyes on her back. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Kang Minho still watching her, his expression unreadable but his gaze intense. Then he turned away, pulling out his phone and making a call, and Sienna thought that was the end of it. Just another humiliating night in her struggling life in Seoul. She had no idea that everything was about to change. The event ended around 11 p.m. Sienna had been told by the manager, in clipped, angry Korean, that her services were no longer needed and she wouldn't be paid for the evening. She'd expected that, but it still stung. $200 she desperately needed, gone because of one accident. She changed out of the server uniform back into her own clothes, jeans and a sweater that had seen better days, and walked out into the cool Seoul night. The hotel was in Gangnam, one of the wealthiest districts in the city, and Sienna felt the contrast sharply as she walked past luxury cars and designer stores toward the subway station. She was about halfway to the station, her mind replaying the evening's humiliation on an endless loop, when a sleek black Mercedes pulled up beside her. The back window rolled down and Sienna's first instinct was fear. It was nearly midnight, she was alone on a relatively empty street, and a car full of strangers was following her. She picked up her pace, but the car kept following slowly, matching her speed. Then a man's voice called out in English, asking her to please wait a moment. The voice was polite, cultured, speaking English with barely any accent. Despite every self-preservation instinct screaming at her to run, Sienna stopped and turned toward the car. The man who spoke was sitting in the back seat, and even in the dim street lighting, Sienna could see he was impeccably dressed in an expensive suit. He was probably in his early 40s, with sharp features and eyes that missed nothing. His name was Jin Taek, though Sienna didn't know that yet. He was Kang Minho's right-hand man, the person who handled all the business that Minho couldn't or wouldn't deal with personally. Jin Taek had been with the organization for 15 years, had risen through the ranks through a combination of loyalty and ruthlessness, and when he said Mr. Kang wanted to speak with her, it wasn't really a request. Sienna's heart was pounding. She asked who Mr. Kang was, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. Jin Taek's response was carefully neutral. Mr. Kang owned the hotel where she'd been working. He'd been impressed by how she handled a difficult situation earlier in the evening. He simply wanted to speak with her briefly. It wouldn't take long. There was a car waiting to take her back to the hotel. Sienna's mind was racing through possibilities, none of them good. In what world did wealthy hotel owners want to speak privately with background servers who'd just been fired? Every reasonable instinct told her to refuse, to walk away, to get on the subway and go home. But here's the thing about desperation. It makes you take risks you'd never normally take. And Sienna was desperate in ways that went beyond just money. She was desperate for her life in Korea to mean something, for her sacrifice of leaving home to pay off, for some indication that the universe hadn't forgotten about her. So when Jin Taek opened the car door and gestured for her to get in, promising that she was perfectly safe and would be compensated for her time, Sienna made a decision that would change her entire life. She got in the car. The drive back to the hotel took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Jin Taek made polite small talk, asking how long she'd been in Korea, what brought her to Seoul, whether she was enjoying her time here. His English was perfect, his manner courteous, but there was something underneath the politeness that felt dangerous. This was a man who knew how to handle problems, and Sienna had the uncomfortable feeling that she might become a problem if this conversation didn't go well. When they arrived at the hotel, she was led not to the main entrance but to a private elevator that required a key card. They rode up in silence to the top floor, and when the doors opened, Sienna found herself in a corridor that looked nothing like the guest areas she'd seen earlier. This was private, exclusive, reserved for people who owned buildings rather than rented rooms in them. Jean-Take led her to a set of double doors, knocked twice, and then opened them to reveal a spacious office that took up what must have been a quarter of the entire floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Seoul's nighttime skyline, millions of lights stretching out in every direction. The office was furnished with expensive minimalist furniture, all clean lines and dark wood and leather. And sitting behind a massive desk, looking exactly as intimidating as he had during the event, was Kang Minho. He gestured for Sienna to sit in one of the chairs facing his desk. Jean-Take quietly left the room, closing the doors behind him, and suddenly Sienna was alone with this powerful stranger in his private office at midnight. For a long moment, Minho just looked at her, his expression giving away nothing. Sienna forced herself to meet his gaze, to not show the fear that was making her hands shake slightly in her lap. She'd learned early in her theater training that confidence, even fake confidence, was power. So she sat up straight, kept her face calm and waited for him to speak. When Minho finally did speak, his English was flawless, his voice low and controlled. He thanked her for coming. He apologized for the unconventional hour and method of invitation. And then he got straight to the point in a way that caught Sienna completely off guard. He said he'd been watching her during the incident with Han Yuri. He'd been impressed by how she handled herself under pressure, how she maintained her dignity when being publicly humiliated. He asked if she knew who Yuri was and Sienna shook her head. So Minho explained, his voice carefully neutral, that Yuri was his ex-girlfriend. They'd dated for 2 years. 3 months ago, she left him for someone else in what was essentially a strategic business move between families. The breakup had been public and designed to humiliate him. And ever since, Minho had been considering how to respond. Sienna listened, her confusion growing. Why was this wealthy, powerful man telling her about his relationship drama? What did any of this have to do with her? Then Minho leaned forward slightly, his cold eyes locked on hers, and made his proposition. He needed someone to play a role. He wanted to hire Sienna to pretend to be his girlfriend for 1 month. There would be 6 high-profile events during that month, gatherings where Seoul's elite would see them together, where Han Yuri would see them together. Sienna would need to be convincing, affectionate, completely committed to the performance. In exchange, he would pay her $50,000. The number hit Sienna like a physical blow. $50,000. She'd made approximately $18,000 in the entire previous year, cobbling together background work and English teaching and every odd job she could find. $50,000 would change her life. It would pay off her student loans from college. It would cover her visa renewal with money to spare. It would give her breathing room to actually pursue the theater work she'd come to Korea for instead of constantly scrambling for survival. But as the initial shock wore off, questions started flooding her mind. Why her specifically? Why would he pay that much money just to make his ex-girlfriend jealous? And most importantly, who was Kang Minho really? She asked him directly, her voice steadier than she felt. What exactly did he do? Who was he? Because this didn't feel like a normal situation, and $50,000 for 1 month of fake dating seemed absurd unless there were complications she didn't know about. Minho's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He gave her a carefully crafted answer. He had business interests in Seoul. He valued his privacy. His personal life had become complicated, and he needed someone who could help him navigate a specific social situation. Anyone who worked with him needed to understand that discretion was absolutely essential. It was a non-answer and they both knew it. Sienna wasn't stupid. She'd lived in Seoul long enough to hear whispers about certain businesses, certain families, certain names that made people lower their voices. She looked at Minho, really looked at him, taking in the expensive suit that probably cost more than her year's rent, the office that screamed wealth and power, the way Jean-Take had addressed him with such careful respect. She thought about how everyone at the event had treated him, the subtle fear mixed with admiration in their eyes. This wasn't just some regular wealthy businessman. This was someone who operated in spaces where normal rules didn't apply. She should have said no. Every rational part of her brain was screaming at her to politely decline and get out of that office as fast as possible. But Sienna was also thinking about her bank account, which currently held about $300. She was thinking about her student loan payments that were overdue. She was thinking about her visa renewal application that she couldn't afford to file. She was thinking about 3 years of struggling, of being invisible, of watching her dreams slip further and further away. And she made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of refusing, she negotiated. She told Minho that $50,000 wasn't enough. If she was going to risk her reputation, risk the complications that would inevitably come from fake dating someone like him, she needed $75,000. And she needed help with her visa renewal, not just money but actual sponsorship documentation that would make the process smooth and guaranteed. She needed stability, not just a temporary financial fix. For a moment after she finished speaking, Minho just stared at her, and Sienna thought she'd made a terrible mistake. You didn't negotiate with men like him. You took what they offered and counted yourself lucky. But then something unexpected happened. Minho smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a slight curve of his lips, but it was genuine. He'd expected her to either refuse out of fear or accept immediately out of desperation. The fact that she'd negotiated showed him she had the kind of strength and intelligence he needed for this plan to work. He agreed without hesitation. $75,000. Complete visa assistance. 1 month, 6 events. Deal. The speed of his agreement told Sienna something important. Money meant absolutely nothing to this man. He could have agreed to twice that amount without blinking. Which meant whatever he was really involved in was far more lucrative and probably far more dangerous than she wanted to know. They spent the next hour establishing rules and expectations. This had to look real, which meant they'd need to spend time together outside of the 6 events. They'd need to learn about each other, create a believable backstory for how they met and fell in love. They'd need to be comfortable with physical affection in public, holding hands, standing close, all the things real couples do. But Minho was explicit about one rule: no real feelings. This was strictly business. The moment the month ended, they would stage a quiet breakup and go their separate ways. Sienna would walk away with her money and her visa, and he would have successfully made his ex-girlfriend jealous. Everyone wins, no complications. Sienna asked what would happen if people found out who he really was, if journalists or gossip sites started digging into their relationship. What was she supposed to say? Minho's response made the room feel about 20 degrees colder. He leaned back in his chair, his expression going completely flat, and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper but somehow more threatening than if he'd shouted. In his world, people who talked about things they weren't supposed to talk about stopped talking very quickly. He had ways of ensuring discretion. As long as she followed the rules, played her part, and kept her mouth shut about anything she saw or heard, she would be protected. But if she betrayed him, if she decided to sell information or go to authorities or cause problems, there would be consequences that she really didn't want to experience. The threat was crystal clear, and Sienna felt genuine fear coil in her stomach. She wasn't dealing with some jealous ex-boyfriend looking for petty revenge. She was dealing with someone who operated in a world where problems were solved with violence, where loyalty was enforced through fear, where people disappeared when they became inconvenient. Every instinct screamed at her to get up and leave. But she also thought about what leaving meant. Back to her cramped apartment, back to checking her bank account 3 times a day, back to the constant anxiety of wondering if next month would be the month she had to give up and go home. So instead of leaving, Sienna asked where she needed to sign. Minho pulled out a contract that Jean Take must have prepared while they were talking. It was surprisingly detailed, outlining every expectation, every rule, every consequence. Sienna read through it carefully, her theater training kicking in as she analyzed the language. This was real. This was legally binding. If she signed this, she was entering into an agreement with someone who clearly had lawyers good enough to make anything stick. But the contract also protected her in certain ways. It guaranteed payment, outlined her responsibilities, and included clauses about her safety. She picked up the expensive pen Minho offered and signed her name. Sienna Valdez. And just like that, she became the fake girlfriend of one of Seoul's most dangerous men. They scheduled their first preparation meeting for 2 days later. Minho explained they needed to build believability quickly because the first event was in less than 2 weeks. They'd meet at a private cafe he owned, closed to the public, where they could talk without being observed. As Sienna stood to leave, Minho said one more thing. He told her to buy some appropriate clothes for the events, designer-level quality, and he'd reimburse her. She shouldn't show up to these gatherings looking like a struggling actress. She needed to look like someone who belonged on his arm. The comment stung, but Sienna understood the calculation behind it. This was theater, and she needed the right costume for her role. Jean Take drove her home, and during that drive, Sienna sat in the back seat of the luxury car feeling like she just stepped through a doorway into another world. She looked out at familiar Seoul streets, but everything felt different now. She had $75,000 coming, her visa problems would be solved, and all she had to do was pretend to love a man who just casually threatened her life if she betrayed him. When the car pulled up in front of her shabby apartment building, the contrast was almost comical. Jean Taek's expression didn't change as he looked at the crumbling facade, but Sienna felt embarrassed anyway. This was her reality, at least for now. 2 days later, she met Minho at the private cafe he'd mentioned. It was in Gangnam, tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place that didn't advertise because it didn't need to. When she arrived, she found the entire cafe empty except for Minho, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee already waiting. He stood when she entered, a gesture of politeness that seemed at odds with the cold criminal she'd met in his office. They sat down, and the awkwardness was immediate and overwhelming. This was supposed to be their first step in building a believable relationship, but neither of them had any idea how to start. Minho approached it like a business negotiation, asking her structured questions about her background, her interests, her history. Where did she grow up? What did her parents do? What brought her to Korea? Sienna answered, but her responses felt rehearsed, like lines she was delivering in a play. She countered with her own questions, learning that Minho had studied at Harvard, that he technically ran a portfolio of legitimate businesses, that he enjoyed classical music and expensive whiskey. But the whole conversation felt stilted, performative, completely unconvincing. After about 20 minutes of this painful exchange, Sienna stopped mid-sentence and just looked at him. She told him straight out that this wasn't working. If he actually wanted to make Han Yuri jealous, he needed to look like a man who was happy, someone who'd found something real and exciting. Right now, he looked like he was conducting a job interview, which technically he was, but nobody else could know that. Yuri had clearly left him for practical, strategic reasons. So if he wanted to hurt her, if he wanted to make her question her decision, he needed to look like he'd found something she'd never given him. Something genuine. Something that couldn't be calculated or bought. He needed to look like a man in love, and she needed to look like a woman who'd made him that way. Minho was taken aback. Nobody spoke to him like that, especially not someone he was paying. But as her words sank in, he realized she was absolutely right. His usual approach to everything, this cold calculation and controlled emotion, was exactly what Yuri had known. If he wanted to genuinely affect her, he needed to show her a side of himself she'd never seen. He needed to look vulnerable, happy, open. All the things he'd trained himself never to be. He asked Sienna how they were supposed to fake that kind of connection, and her response was simple but challenging. They needed to actually talk to each other like human beings, not business partners. They needed to find something real to connect over, even if the relationship itself was fake. So they started over. This time they talked like actual people instead of reading from a script. Sienna told him about growing up in Atlanta, about her father's church where she'd spent every Sunday singing in the choir, about her mother who worked as a nurse and always worried about her being so far from home. She talked about the first time she'd seen a professional theater production, a touring company's performance of A Raisin in the Sun, and how something had clicked in her teenage brain. That was what she wanted to do with her life. She wanted to tell stories that mattered, that moved people, that made them feel seen. She'd saved every penny from her college jobs to buy that one-way ticket to Seoul, chasing an international theater dream that had proven much harder to catch than she'd imagined. Minho found himself actually listening, not just gathering information but genuinely interested. He told her about his mother, something he rarely talked about with anyone. She died when he was 12, cancer that spread too fast for even their money and connections to stop. She'd been the gentle counterbalance to his father's brutality, the person who'd wanted him to become a pianist, who'd filled their home with classical music and dreams of a different life. After she died, there was no buffer between Minho and his father's expectations. He was molded, sometimes violently, into the heir his father needed. Harvard was allowed only because it would make him a more effective leader. Every choice, every relationship, every moment had been calculated for maximum strategic benefit. As they talked, something shifted in the air between them. They were still playing roles, still executing a plan, but there was a thread of genuine connection weaving through the performance. Sienna made an observation that caught Minho completely off guard. She pointed out that they were both pretending to be something they weren't. She was pretending to be someone who belonged in his world of wealth and power. He was pretending his life was normal and legitimate. Maybe that made them perfect for each other, at least for the purposes of this arrangement. The comment was sharp, honest, and unexpectedly funny. And Kang Minho, the cold crime lord who never showed genuine emotion, actually laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle or a calculated response. It was a real laugh, surprised and genuine, and the moment it happened both of them felt it. This connection they were supposed to fake, this chemistry they needed to manufacture for public consumption, it was actually there. Somewhere underneath the contract and the money and the strategic revenge plot, there was a spark of something real. Neither of them acknowledged it out loud. That would have violated the rules they'd carefully established. But as they left the cafe that afternoon, both of them knew that the performance they were about to stage would be far more dangerous than either had anticipated. Because the line between fake and real, between business and feeling, was already starting to blur. And here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever had to pretend to feel something that suddenly became real? Have you ever started a relationship, a friendship, or even a job that was supposed to be temporary and strategic, only to find yourself genuinely invested? Drop your story in the comments because what's about to happen to Sienna and Minho is something I think a lot of us can relate to. And if you're invested in this story, if you want to see how a $75,000 contract turns into something that changes two lives forever, hit that subscribe button right now. Because the first public event is coming up, and neither Sienna nor Minho is prepared for what's about to happen when they step into Seoul's elite social scene as a couple. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. The first event arrived faster than either of them expected. 10 days after signing that contract, Sienna found herself standing in front of her cramped bathroom mirror, trying to transform into someone who belonged in Kang Minho's world. She'd spent an entire day shopping in Gangnam with the money he'd given her for appropriate clothing, wandering through designer boutiques where the sales associates had looked at her with barely concealed judgment until she started pulling out Minho's black card. She'd chosen a midnight blue dress that hugged her curves in all the right places, elegant but not trying too hard, with her braids styled up in a way that showed off her long neck and the delicate gold jewelry she'd borrowed from a friend. When she looked at herself in that tiny bathroom mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked expensive. She looked like she belonged somewhere other than this shabby Itaewon studio. The event was an art gallery opening in Hanam-dong, one of Seoul's most exclusive neighborhoods, showcasing a famous contemporary Korean artist whose work sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Minho had sent a car for her, and when it pulled up outside the gallery, Sienna took 3 deep breaths before stepping out. The moment her heels touched the pavement, she felt eyes turning toward her. The gallery entrance was crowded with Seoul's elite, women in designer gowns and men in custom suits, all of them representing old money, new money, and everything in between. And there, waiting at the entrance in a perfectly tailored black suit that probably cost more than a luxury car, was Kang Minho. When he saw her step out of the car, something flickered across his usually controlled expression. Surprise, maybe appreciation, definitely approval. He walked toward her with that predatory grace he had, and when he reached her, he did something they'd practiced but that still made her heart skip. He took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles while maintaining eye contact. It was old-fashioned, intimate, and exactly the kind of gesture that would make people pay attention. Then he leaned in close, his lips near her ear, and whispered that she looked incredible. The whisper sent shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with the performance they were supposed to be giving. They walked into the gallery together, his hand resting on the small of her back, and Sienna felt the room's energy shift the moment they entered. Conversations didn't stop, but they changed. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Whispers started rippling through the crowd like waves. Because Seoul's elite knew exactly who Kang Minho was, or at least they knew his carefully constructed public persona as a successful businessman with rumored connections to more questionable enterprises. What they absolutely didn't expect was to see him arrive with a black American woman on his arm, someone who looked nothing like the Korean socialites and actresses he'd been photographed with before. The whispers followed them as they moved through the gallery, pretending to admire paintings that probably had more meaning to the critics than to either of them. Sienna could hear fragments of conversations in Korean, some people trying to be discreet and others not bothering. They were speculating about who she was, where she came from, how long this had been going on. Some of the comments had sharper edges, questioning what someone like Minho was doing with a foreigner, suggesting it was just a phase or a rebellion or a publicity stunt. And some comments went even darker, with racial undertones that made Sienna's jaw tighten even as she kept her smile perfectly in place. A woman in a cream-colored Chanel suit approached them, all artificial smiles and calculated curiosity. She greeted Minho in Korean with exaggerated warmth, then turned to Sienna with a look that assessed her from head to toe in about 3 seconds. In English spoken with a thick accent, she asked where Sienna was from, then immediately followed up by saying she must be a model or something, because surely that's what foreign girls in Seoul do. The compliment was wrapped in condescension, suggesting that Sienna couldn't possibly be interesting or accomplished in her own right. Sienna responded with perfect politeness, explaining she was an actress and theater performer, that she'd been living in Seoul for 3 years, that she loved the city's energy and culture. But the woman barely listened to her answer before turning back to Minho and launching into Korean conversation that excluded Sienna entirely. Minho noticed. He noticed how Sienna's smile stayed perfectly in place but her eyes went cold. He noticed how her shoulders tensed just slightly, how her breathing changed. And he did something that surprised even himself. He gently interrupted the woman mid-sentence and responded in English, explaining that Sienna was telling him about her recent theater project and he wanted to hear more. It was a subtle defense, shifting the conversation to include Sienna, making it clear that excluding her wasn't acceptable. The woman in the Chanel suit looked momentarily flustered before making her excuses and walking away. When she left, Sienna glanced at Minho with genuine gratitude mixed with surprise. He squeezed her hand briefly, a gesture that wasn't part of their practiced performance. They continued moving through the gallery, and Sienna handled each microaggression with the same graceful composure. When someone asked if she was a K-pop backup dancer, she smiled and corrected them. When someone complimented her Korean as so good for a foreigner, she thanked them genuinely. When someone asked Minho directly in Korean if this was serious, Sienna understood enough to feel the insult but kept her expression neutral. And Minho, watching her navigate this minefield of subtle and not-so-subtle racism, found himself genuinely impressed. This wasn't just acting. This was strength. Then Han Yuri arrived. Sienna saw Minho's entire body language shift before she even turned to see what he was looking at. His hand on her back pressed slightly firmer, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his carefully neutral expression went even more carefully neutral. Yuri entered with her fiancé, wearing a red dress that must have cost a fortune, her hair and makeup absolutely flawless. She was stunning in that calculated way that came from having professional stylists and unlimited money. She saw Minho immediately and for just a fraction of a second, her composure cracked. Her eyes widened, her smile faltered and she stopped mid-step. She was clearly shocked to see him there and even more shocked to see him with someone else. Yuri recovered quickly, her socialite training kicking in, and she walked toward them with renewed purpose. Her fiancé followed, looking vaguely uncomfortable, clearly aware of the complicated history between these three people. When Yuri reached them, she greeted Minho in Korean with false warmth, then turned to Sienna with an expression that was pure calculation disguised as curiosity. In English that was significantly better than the other guests, she introduced herself and asked how Sienna and Minho had met. It was a test, checking if they had their story straight, looking for cracks in whatever this relationship was. Minho started to answer, but Sienna surprised him by speaking first. She explained they'd met at one of his hotels, that she'd been working an event and he'd been impressed by how she'd handled a difficult situation. It was technically true, which made the lie easier to sell. She added, with a smile that looked absolutely genuine, that Minho had been pursuing her for weeks before she finally agreed to go out with him. The addition wasn't part of their rehearsed story, but it served a purpose. It suggested Minho had worked for this relationship, that he'd been the one chasing, that Sienna had been the prize. Yuri's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. That narrative clearly bothered her. Then Sienna did something that neither Minho nor Yuri expected. She reached up and touched Minho's face, her fingers gentle against his jaw, turning him slightly toward her. She laughed at something, an intimate laugh that suggested they'd been sharing private jokes, and looked at him with an expression that seemed genuinely affectionate. It was improvisation, pure acting instinct, but it was devastatingly effective. To everyone watching, including Yuri, it looked like a woman completely comfortable with her partner, someone who had the kind of easy intimacy that comes from real connection. Even Minho was caught off guard. For a moment, looking down at Sienna with her hand on his face and that warmth in her eyes, he forgot they were acting. The moment stretched just long enough to be noticed by everyone around them before Sienna dropped her hand and turned back to Yuri with a polite smile. Yuri's composure was definitely cracking now. She made some excuse about needing to greet other guests and walked away with her fiancé, but Sienna could feel her watching them for the rest of the evening. Mission accomplished. They'd successfully made Han Yuri jealous, proven that Minho had moved on, and created exactly the kind of buzz that would spread through Seoul's social circles by morning. They stayed at the gallery for another hour, playing their roles perfectly, before finally making their exit together. In the car on the way back to drop Sienna at her apartment, there was a charged silence. Finally Minho spoke, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect. He told her she was better at this than he'd expected, that her improvisation with touching his face had been brilliant, that she'd handled every uncomfortable moment with exactly the right balance of grace and strength. Sienna accepted the compliment, but inside she was dealing with something more complicated. Because when she'd touched his face, when she'd looked at him with that affectionate expression, it hadn't felt entirely like acting. And that was dangerous. Over the next 2 weeks, something shifted in their arrangement. What had started as strategic meetings to maintain their cover story turned into something that felt increasingly real. They started meeting for coffee, ostensibly to be seen together, but their conversations went deeper than necessary for simple cover. Sienna learned about Minho's childhood in pieces, stories that came out slowly like he was testing whether she could handle the truth. His father had been brutal, treating him less like a son and more like a soldier being trained for war. Emotions were weaknesses to be beaten out of him, literally sometimes. His mother's death when he was 12 had removed the only person who'd ever shown him gentleness, leaving him completely at the mercy of a man who believed love made you vulnerable and vulnerability got you killed. Minho had built his entire empire, both legitimate and criminal, on cold calculation and controlled emotion. He'd learned to see every relationship as transactional, every interaction as strategic. Yuri's betrayal had hurt not because he loved her, though he thought he did at the time, but because he trusted her, and trust was the one thing he rarely gave anyone. Sienna listened to these revelations, and the irony wasn't lost on her. She came from a completely different world, grew up in her father's church surrounded by messages about love and redemption and moral foundations. And here she was, being paid to pretend to love someone who operated in a world built on violence and fear. The contradiction sat uncomfortably in her chest. But Minho was learning about her too. He learned about her passion for theater, how she'd seen it as a way to tell stories that mattered, to make people feel seen and understood. He learned about her family back in Atlanta, her mother who worried constantly, her father who prayed for her safety every night, her younger brother who sent her silly memes to make her laugh when she was homesick. He learned that despite 3 years of struggling in Seoul, despite the financial desperation that had led her to accept his offer, Sienna hadn't lost the core of who she was. She still believed in goodness, still had faith that people could change, still carried her father's moral teachings even when her actions contradicted them. Their second public event was the opening of an exclusive restaurant in Gangnam, the kind of place where reservations were booked 6 months in advance and the tasting menu cost more than most people's monthly rent. They arrived together, and this time there was less shock, more acceptance. Seoul's elite had processed the news of Minho's new girlfriend, and while whispers still followed them, there was a subtle shift. Some people were warming to the idea, curious about this confident American woman who seemed completely unfazed by the attention. Others remained skeptical or outright hostile, but their opinions mattered less when Minho made it clear through his actions that Sienna belonged at his side. Halfway through the evening, Yuri approached them directly. Her fiancé wasn't with her this time, and there was something almost desperate in how she sought them out. She engaged Sienna in conversation, asking questions that seemed friendly on the surface but carried sharp edges underneath. She complimented Sienna's dress while somehow making it sound like a criticism. She asked about Sienna's career with a tone that suggested it couldn't possibly be important. She made reference to cultural differences in a way that highlighted Sienna's outsider status. Every comment was designed to make Sienna feel small, to remind everyone listening that she didn't really belong in this world. But Sienna had spent 3 years navigating microaggressions and outright racism in Seoul. She developed armor that looked like confidence and grace. She responded to each of Yuri's backhanded compliments with genuine warmth, refusing to take the bait, turning potential insults into opportunities to showcase her intelligence and composure. When Yuri mentioned cultural differences, Sienna agreed enthusiastically and talked about everything she loved about Korean culture while subtly pointing out that appreciation for difference was a sign of sophistication. When Yuri questioned her career, Sienna spoke passionately about theater as an art form, making it clear that she valued meaningful work over social status. By the end of the conversation, Yuri was the one who looked small, and Sienna had won the respect of everyone who'd been listening. Minho watched this entire exchange with something that felt uncomfortably close to pride. He'd hired Sienna to play a role, but she was exceeding every expectation. She wasn't just pretending to be someone who belonged in his world. She was claiming her space in it, refusing to be diminished, showing strength that had nothing to do with money or power and everything to do with character. When Yuri finally walked away, clearly frustrated that her attempts at humiliation had failed, Minho leaned close to Sienna and whispered that she was extraordinary. The compliment felt genuine, not part of their performance, and Sienna felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the expensive champagne she'd been drinking. Later that night, after they'd left the restaurant and were sitting in the back of his car heading toward her apartment, Minho did something unexpected. He opened up about why Yuri's betrayal had hurt so much. It wasn't love, he explained, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. He'd thought it was love at the time, but looking back he realized it was something else. It was trust. In his world, trust was currency more valuable than money. He'd trusted Yuri with parts of himself he'd never shown anyone else, and she'd used that knowledge to calculate her exit strategy. She'd left him not just for another man but for a better deal, and she'd done it publicly to maximize her own advantage. The betrayal had cut deep not because his heart was broken but because he'd been reminded that even people you trust will sell you out if the price is right. Sienna listened, and for the first time she saw past the crime lord exterior to the human underneath. She saw a man who'd been taught that emotion was weakness, who'd built walls so high around himself that nobody could get close enough to hurt him, but who desperately wanted connection even while being terrified of it. She understood why he'd created this arrangement, why he'd hired her instead of pursuing a real relationship. This way he controlled all the variables. This way nobody could betray him because there were no real feelings to betray. Except that somewhere in the past 2 weeks, real feelings had started creeping in anyway. For both of them. 3 weeks into their arrangement, everything started getting complicated in ways neither of them had anticipated. Paparazzi photos of Sienna and Minho together had started appearing online, not just in gossip sites but in legitimate entertainment news. Seoul was fascinated by this unlikely couple, and speculation about their relationship was everywhere. Some articles were positive, praising Minho for stepping outside conventional expectations and celebrating Sienna's style and confidence. Other articles were viciously critical, questioning her motives, calling her a gold digger, making racist comments about foreign women targeting wealthy Korean men. The attention was overwhelming. Sienna's friends, the small community of foreign performers and teachers she'd built in Seoul, started warning her. They knew or had heard rumors about who Minho really was. They told her stories about his family's organization, about violence and illegal operations, about people who'd crossed them and disappeared. They asked if she knew what she was getting into, if she understood the danger. Sienna found herself defending him, which scared her because she was supposed to be emotionally detached from this arrangement. She told herself it was just business, just money, just a performance. But she was lying and she knew it. Minho's world was noticing changes too. His associates, the men who'd worked for his organization for years, were concerned. Their boss was distracted, softer around this American woman, showing vulnerability they'd never seen before. In their world, vulnerability meant weakness, and weakness invited challenges. Jean Take, his right-hand man, pulled him aside one day and asked directly if this was still just an arrangement or if it had become something else. Minho insisted it was still business, still part of the plan to make Yuri jealous. But even as he said it, he knew he was lying. The third event was a charity gala at one of Seoul's most prestigious hotels, a black tie affair where Korea's wealthiest citizens gathered to donate money to causes that would improve their public image. Sienna wore a gold dress that caught the light with every movement, and when Minho saw her, the look in his eyes went beyond appreciation into something deeper. They moved through the evening like a real couple now, completely comfortable with each other, their chemistry undeniable to anyone watching. They danced together, and being in his arms felt natural in a way that terrified Sienna. This was supposed to be acting, but it didn't feel like acting anymore. During their dance, with the ballroom lights dimmed and soft music playing, Minho leaned close and whispered something in her ear. He told her that she made him feel like a different person, like someone who could exist outside the boxes his life had built around him. It wasn't part of their performance. It wasn't calculated or strategic. It was real, vulnerable, and completely unexpected. Sienna pulled back just enough to look at his face, and for once, his carefully controlled expression was gone. She could see genuine emotion in his eyes, something that looked like longing mixed with fear. Across the ballroom, Han Yuri watched them dance, and her jealousy was written all over her face. Her relationship with her fiancé was clearly strategic and loveless, all careful smiles and proper distance. She'd gotten what she wanted in terms of family alliance and social standing, but she'd lost something she hadn't fully valued until it was gone. Watching Minho look at Sienna with such obvious emotion, seeing the genuine connection between them, Yuri realized she'd miscalculated. She'd thought Minho would stay frozen in his cold, controlled existence. She'd never imagined he'd find someone who could actually thaw him. The plan was working perfectly, except that it wasn't a plan anymore. After the gala ended, Minho's driver took them back through Seoul's nighttime streets. They sat in the back seat, closer than necessary, the air between them thick with tension. The partition between them and the driver was up, giving them privacy, and in that private space something almost happened. They turned toward each other at the same moment, their faces inches apart, and for several heartbeats, they both knew they were about to kiss. A real kiss, not part of the performance, not for any audience. But then reality crashed back in. The contract. The rules. The agreement that this was strictly business. They both pulled back simultaneously, creating distance, retreating to opposite sides of the back seat. The tension was unbearable. But reality had another lesson to teach Sienna about exactly who she was dealing with. A few days later, she was at Minho's penthouse apartment for what was supposed to be a casual evening to maintain their cover. They were on the terrace overlooking Seoul when Jean Taek arrived unexpectedly with two other men, bringing a third man who was clearly a prisoner. Minho's entire demeanor changed instantly, the warmth disappearing, replaced by cold authority. He told Sienna to go inside, but she was frozen, watching as Minho dealt with this business situation. The details weren't graphic, but she heard enough, saw enough, understood enough. These men had betrayed the organization, stolen money, made deals with rivals. And Minho was personally handling the consequences in ways that made Sienna's blood run cold. When it was over, when Jean Taek and the others had left, Sienna confronted him. Her hands were shaking, her voice unsteady, as she demanded to know what she'd just witnessed. How could he do that? How could he hurt people so casually? Minho's response was chilling in its coldness. He reminded her, his voice flat and emotionless, that she'd known what he was when she took the money. She'd signed a contract with a man who operated in darkness. She didn't get to act shocked now that she'd seen that darkness up close. If she wanted to end the arrangement early, he'd pay her what they'd agreed and she could walk away. But she didn't get to judge him for being exactly what he'd always been. Sienna spent the next 2 days wrestling with her conscience. She should end this. She should take whatever money he'd give her and get as far away as possible from Kang Minho and his dangerous world. But two things stopped her. First, she was in too deep financially. She'd already spent some of the advance money on her visa application, on paying down her student loans, on things she desperately needed. Walking away would mean financial disaster. And second, more frighteningly, she was in too deep emotionally. Despite everything she'd just witnessed, despite knowing exactly what kind of man he was, she couldn't stop thinking about him. She couldn't stop remembering the way he looked at her when they danced, the vulnerability in his voice when he told her she made him feel different. She was falling for a man who terrified her, and she had no idea how to stop. Then at 2 a.m. on a Thursday night, Sienna's doorbell rang. She opened it to find Minho standing there, and he looked nothing like the controlled crime lord she'd seen dealing with betrayal days earlier. He looked shaken, almost lost, his usually perfect appearance disheveled. He said he didn't know why he'd come, that he shouldn't be there, but he needed to see her. Something from his past had resurfaced. Someone he'd thought was dead was alive and looking for revenge, and for the first time in years, Kang Minho felt genuinely afraid. Not of death, but of losing the small piece of humanity he'd found with Sienna. She should have closed the door. She should have protected herself from further involvement in his dangerous life. But instead, she stepped aside and let him in. They sat on her small couch in her cramped apartment, this crime lord who owned hotels and penthouses sitting surrounded by her second-hand furniture and theater posters, and they talked until sunrise. He told her things he'd never told anyone about the violence he'd witnessed as a child, about the first time his father forced him to hurt someone to prove his loyalty, about the nightmares he still had about his mother's death. He admitted something that clearly cost him to say, that she was the only person who looked at him like he was human, not a tool or a threat or a business opportunity. Just human. Sienna listened, and somewhere in those early morning hours, she made a confession that was equally terrifying. She told him that he scared her, that his world scared her, that everything about this situation went against every value her father had taught her growing up. But despite all of that, despite knowing it was the stupidest thing she could possibly do, she couldn't stop thinking about him. He'd gotten under her skin in a way that had nothing to do with their contract or performance. When she looked at him, she didn't just see the crime lord everyone feared. She saw the boy who'd lost his mother, the man who'd never been allowed to be vulnerable, the person trapped in a life he'd inherited rather than chosen. The sun was starting to rise over Seoul, pale light filtering through her small window, when they finally stopped talking. They were sitting close on the couch, exhausted from emotional honesty, and the silence stretched between them heavy with everything they'd just admitted. Then Minho reached out and touched her face, his fingers gentle against her cheek, and asked if she understood what crossing this line would mean. It would mean breaking their agreement. It would mean real feelings in a situation that was supposed to be fake. It would mean danger because everyone in his world would see her as a weakness to exploit. She nodded, understanding all of it, accepting all of it. And they kissed, finally, genuinely, with nothing fake or performative about it. What happened next unfolded naturally, inevitably, two people who'd been fighting attraction for weeks finally giving in. They crossed every line they'd drawn, broke every rule they'd established, and transformed their business arrangement into something real and complicated and dangerous. When Sienna woke up hours later with Minho still asleep beside her in her small bed, she knew everything had changed. They couldn't go back to pretending now. They couldn't hide behind contracts and performances. Whatever happened next, they'd be facing it as something neither of them had planned for. A real couple in an impossibly complicated situation. So here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever crossed a line you swore you'd never cross? Have you ever fallen for someone you knew was wrong for you in every logical way but felt right in every emotional way? Drop your answer in the comments because Sienna and Minho's story is about to get a whole lot more complicated. And if you're invested in finding out what happens when their fake relationship becomes devastatingly real, when Minho's dangerous past catches up with them, and when Sienna has to decide between safety and the man who's stolen her heart, hit that subscribe button right now. Because the next part of this story involves consequences neither of them saw coming, and you absolutely don't want to miss it. The morning after their night together, both Sienna and Minho wake up with the crushing weight of reality settling over them. Everything has changed. The carefully constructed walls they'd built, the professional distance they'd maintained, all of it shattered in a single night of vulnerability and passion. Sienna is the first to pull away emotionally. This was a mistake, she tells him, her voice hollow, her eyes refusing to meet his. Minho, reverting to the cold businessman he's always been, agrees without hesitation. We had rules for a reason. The words cut deeper than either of them expects. They both know the truth, they've crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. 4 days afterward, they avoid each other completely. Sienna throws herself into her teaching work, trying to forget the feeling of his arms around her, the way he'd whispered her name like it was something precious. Minho buries himself in business meetings and cold negotiations, telling himself it was just physical, just a moment of weakness. But the contract still hangs over them like a sword. There are 2 more events. 2 more times they'll have to stand side by side, pretending everything is fine, pretending they haven't fallen for each other in the most inconvenient, impossible way. Then Yuri makes her move. Jilted, humiliated, and burning with the need for revenge, she does what the wealthy and scorned do best. She destroys. Somehow, through her network of connections and paid informants, Yuri discovers the truth. Sienna isn't Minho's real girlfriend. She's being paid. She's an employee playing a role. And Yuri leaks it everywhere. Within hours, the story explodes across gossip sites, social media, and entertainment news platforms. Kang Minho's fake girlfriend, the black American woman he paid to make his ex jealous. The backlash is swift and vicious. Sienna becomes an instant target. Comments flood in calling her a gold digger, a prostitute, worse. The racial slurs are particularly brutal, attacking her for being black, for being foreign, for daring to exist in spaces they believe don't belong to her. People she thought were friends suddenly distance themselves. Messages go unanswered. Invitations are quietly rescinded. Even worse, she starts losing teaching jobs. Parents don't want her around their children. Schools that once praised her work now find convenient reasons to terminate her contracts. Her entire life in Korea, built over years of hard work and determination, begins crumbling around her. Minho's reputation takes a hit too, though in a different way. The business world, the underworld, they're all talking. Kang Minho, the cold, untouchable businessman, looks weak. He paid for love. He couldn't win a woman naturally. He needed to buy companionship. For a man whose power comes from respect and fear, this revelation is devastating. Associates question his judgment. Rivals sense weakness. The carefully cultivated image of invincibility shows its first cracks. When Sienna finally confronts him, it's explosive. She storms into his office, past security, past assistants, and slams the door behind her. "You destroyed my life," she screams. "I did this for your petty revenge against your ex, and now I'm the one paying for it. I've lost my jobs, my friends, my reputation. People are calling me things I won't even repeat. And for what? So you could feel powerful? So you could hurt someone who hurt you." Minho, overwhelmed and reverting to the only defense mechanism he knows, goes cold. Ice cold. Without a word, he opens his desk drawer, pulls out a check, and slides it across the desk. It's for the full contracted amount, everything she was supposed to earn through the end of their agreement. Consider the contract terminated early, he says, his voice devoid of emotion. This is why I don't do emotions. They make you weak. They make you vulnerable. They destroy everything. His eyes, which had been so warm that night in his penthouse, are now empty. The walls are back up higher and thicker than before. Sienna stares at the check, then at him. For a moment, something flickers in her expression. Hurt, disappointment, maybe even residual love. But then she picks up the check, folds it carefully and puts it in her purse. You're right, she says quietly. Emotions do make you weak. But they also make you human. And you've spent so long being a monster that you've forgotten the difference. She walks out, and the sound of the door closing behind her feels like the final chapter of something that could have been beautiful. 2 weeks pass. Sienna makes arrangements to leave Korea. She's done. The country that once felt like a second home now feels hostile and unwelcoming. She buys a plane ticket, packs her apartment, says goodbye to the few friends who've stuck by her. She's preparing for a fresh start, somewhere far from the judgment, the pain, and the memory of a man who showed her glimpses of his humanity before retreating back into darkness. But Minho is drowning. His world, once meticulously ordered and controlled, feels empty. He goes through the motions, meetings, deals, negotiations, but nothing matters. Food tastes like ash. Sleep won't come. The penthouse feels cavernous and cold. He keeps finding reminders of Sienna, a book she left behind, the coffee mug she used that morning, the scent of her perfume that still lingers in certain rooms. He tells himself he's fine. This is better. Safer. Emotions are weakness, just like he said. Jean Take, his right-hand man and closest thing to a friend, finally confronts him. Boss, he says, watching Minho stare out the window at the Seoul skyline, you're miserable. Anyone with eyes can see it. Just admit you love her. Minho doesn't respond, but his jaw tightens. Jean Take presses on. You spent all this energy on revenge against Yuri. What did it get you? Nothing. But Sienna, she gave you something you've never had. Something real. A genuine connection. And you threw it away because you're scared. That night, alone in his penthouse, Minho finally lets himself feel it. The realization hits him like a physical blow. His pursuit of revenge against Yuri was pointless. It was a hollow victory that meant nothing. But Sienna had seen past the reputation, past the danger, past the cold exterior everyone else saw. She'd looked at him and seen a person. A human being capable of warmth and laughter and love. She'd challenged him, matched him, refused to be intimidated by his power. And he'd pushed her away because loving her terrified him. Because in his world, the people you love become targets. Weapons your enemies use against you. But the universe has a cruel sense of timing. Just as Minho's preparing to go to her, to beg her forgiveness, to tell her he'll do whatever it takes, a rival organization makes their move. They've been watching. They've seen the gossip, read between the lines, and figured out what Minho himself only just admitted. Sienna means something to him. She's valuable. Which makes her the perfect leverage. Minho is in a meeting when he receives the package. Inside is Sienna's teaching ID card, broken in half, and a single photograph of her bound to a chair, eyes wide with fear but still defiant. The message is clear, they have her. If he wants her back alive, he'll come alone. He'll trade himself for her. His cold mask doesn't just crack this time, it shatters completely. Raw fear floods his features, followed by a rage so intense that everyone in the room takes a step back. Jean Take has never seen his boss like this. No one has. Because Kang Minho, the man who built an empire on calculated coldness, is genuinely terrified of losing someone. Within an hour, Minho mobilizes his entire organization. Every contact, every resource, every person who owes him a favor. But even as his people work to track Sienna's location, Minho knows what he has to do. He's going to walk into their trap. Willingly. Because her life is worth more than his, and if he can buy her safety with his own blood, he'll do it without hesitation. The location comes through, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where bad things happen and nobody asks questions. Minho arrives as instructed. Alone, unarmed, hands visible. His rivals are waiting, a dozen men with guns and Sienna in the center tied to a chair. When she sees him, her eyes widen. Minho no. It's a trap. One of the captors backhands her into silence. The leader of the rival gang steps forward, smirking. The great Kang Minho, he mocks. Brought down by feelings for some foreign woman. Did you really think you could love someone like her and not have consequences? You're weak. Pathetic. Trading your empire for a... He uses a slur so vile that Minho's hands ball into fists. But Minho's voice when he speaks is steady. She's worth more than all of us combined, he says quietly. More than you. More than me. More than anything I've built. So here's the deal, let her go and I'm yours. Do whatever you want with me. But she walks out of here unharmed. The rival considers this, still smirking, but he's made a fatal miscalculation. Because Minho didn't come alone. Not really. Outside the warehouse, positioned with military precision, are Jean Take and Minho's most trusted people. At Minho's signal, a barely perceptible gesture, all hell breaks loose. The doors burst open. What follows is violent and chaotic, but the outcome was never in doubt. Minho's people are better trained, better equipped, and fighting for something more than money or territory. They're fighting for family. When the dust settles, Minho cuts through Sienna's bonds with shaking hands. She collapses into his arms, trembling, and he holds her like she might disappear if he loosens his grip even slightly. I've got you, he whispers into her hair over and over. I've got you. You're safe. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. At the hospital, Sienna is treated for minor injuries, bruises, rope burns, shock. Physically, she'll be fine. But the terror of those hours shows in her eyes. Minho doesn't leave her side. He holds her hand, brings her water, speaks softly when she flinches at sudden sounds. But as the night wears on and she's cleared to leave, he makes a decision that breaks his heart. I'm letting you go, he tells her, his voice rough with emotion. You'll never be safe with me, Sienna. This is my world, danger, violence, enemies who don't care who gets hurt. I've already arranged everything. New identity, money, visa, everything you need to start over in the US. Somewhere far from here, from me, from all of this. He expects relief. Maybe even gratitude. What he gets instead is anger. Sienna pulls her hand from his and sits up straighter despite her exhaustion. No, she says firmly. I'm not running. You don't get to make this decision for me, Minho. You don't get to play hero by pushing me away. You could have died tonight. But I didn't. I'm here and I'm choosing to be here. You want to know what I think? She's crying now, but her voice doesn't waver. I think you're terrified. Not of them. Of yourself. Of being vulnerable. You've spent your whole life being what your world demanded, cold, ruthless, untouchable. When do you get to just be human? When do you get to want something for yourself and not apologize for it? Her words cut through every defense he has left. Because she's right. He spent decades building walls, playing a role, becoming the person his world required him to be. And he's exhausted. Bone deep exhausted from pretending he doesn't feel, doesn't want, doesn't need anyone. What if I can't change? He asks quietly. What if this is all I know how to be? Then you learn, Sienna says, taking his hand again. But you don't get to decide for both of us. If I'm staying, it's my choice. My risk. You don't protect me by leaving me, you protect me by being better. That conversation becomes the catalyst for the most dramatic decision of Minho's life. Over the following weeks and months, he begins the painstaking, dangerous process of legitimizing his operations. He meets with authorities, cuts deals for immunity in exchange for information and cooperation. He dismantles the dangerous, violent arms of his empire piece by piece. It's costly. He loses allies, makes new enemies, bleeds money and resources. Some nights he's not sure he'll survive the transition. But Sienna is there, not interfering, not coddling him, but present. Watching. Waiting to see if the change is real. She keeps her distance romantically during this time, which might be the hardest part for Minho. She's living in her own apartment, rebuilding her teaching career, slowly reclaiming her life. But she checks in. She shows up when he needs someone to talk to. She becomes what she was during those contract dates, a mirror reflecting back his better self. And slowly, painfully, Minho transforms from the cold, untouchable businessman into something more complicated, more human. 6 months pass. 6 months of therapy, negotiations, life-threatening meetings, and gradual change. And then comes the wedding, the one we saw at the very beginning of this story. The elegant venue, the confused and curious guests, the unlikely union that breaks every social rule. Minho's remaining family is there, shocked but present. His mother, who hasn't spoken to him in years, wipes tears from her eyes. His younger sister, who distanced herself from his world, sits in the front row. Sienna's father, the pastor who had so many reservations about his daughter's choices, performs a blessing despite everything. It's not the wedding either of them imagined in their younger years, but it's real. Deeply, profoundly real. Yuri is in the crowd too. Her strategic marriage to the businessman she chose instead of Minho fell apart within months. She's alone now, watching the man she thought she'd destroyed find happiness with the woman she tried to ruin. But this moment isn't about revenge anymore. Miho doesn't look at Yuri with triumph or satisfaction. He barely notices her. Because his entire attention is on Sienna, stunning in her dress, looking at him with love and challenge and hope all mixed together. When it comes time for vows, Miho's voice shakes. I spent my whole life building walls, he says, becoming someone untouchable because I thought that was strength. You showed me that real courage is letting someone in. You didn't just see past my reputation, you demanded I become more than it. I promised to spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of your courage, your faith, and your love. I promise to be human even when it's terrifying. Especially when it's terrifying. Sienna's vows are simpler but no less powerful. I promise to see the man, not the monster, she says. To remind you who you are when you forget. To stand beside you, not behind you. And to never, ever let you hide from yourself again. When they kiss, the applause is mixed. Some enthusiastic, some hesitant, some confused. But it doesn't matter. Because for the first time in his life, Kang Minho looks genuinely happy. Not satisfied. Not victorious. Happy. The kind of bone-deep contentment that comes from being fully known and still fully loved. As the night winds down and they prepare to leave, Minho whispers something in Sienna's ear that makes her laugh. A genuine, bright sound that echoes through the venue. Nobody knows what he said. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe it was something sweet. Maybe it was a promise. But that laugh, and the way he looks at her when she makes that sound, tells everyone watching everything they need to know about what this marriage really is. The story of Kang Minho and Sienna Williams is not a fairy tale. It's messier, darker, more complicated than that. It's a story of how a transaction became a transformation. How a contract meant for revenge became the catalyst for redemption. Sienna didn't just become his wife. She became the mirror that reflected back his humanity when he'd forgotten he had any. She became the voice that demanded he be better, do better, choose better. Not because she was naive or because she thought love could erase a dark past, but because she saw potential for growth beneath the layers of ice and armor. Love doesn't erase the past. The things Minho did, the person he was, those facts don't disappear because he fell in love with someone who challenged him. But love can reshape the future. It can become the reason someone chooses differently, acts differently, transforms themselves from who they were into who they could be. Minho and Sienna still face judgment. From society, from family, from people who think they understand their story based on headlines and rumors. They still face danger because you don't walk away from that world completely unscathed. And they still face difficult days, moments when old patterns threaten to resurface, when fear tries to rebuild those walls. But they face it together. Not as a powerful man and the woman he saved, but as equals. As partners who challenge each other, support each other, and refuse to let each other hide from the truth. Sienna didn't need rescuing, she needed a partner brave enough to be vulnerable. And Minho didn't need someone to worship his power, he needed someone to see past it and demand his humanity. Their story reminds us that people are not their worst moments, but they're also not absolved by their best intentions. Change is possible, but it's painful, costly, and requires sustained choice and effort. Love can be transformative, but only if both people are willing to do the hard work of growth. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is look at someone everyone else has written off and say, I see who you could be, and I'm going to stand here while you become that person. What would you have done in Sienna's position? Could you fall in love with someone from a world so different from your own? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible true story transformations.